welcome to this Emerging Payments Association Asia last hot topic briefing for the year on the topic of the value of ISO20022 for corporate banking. And we have run several events on this topic through the year, and we've issued several articles. So some of you might have seen the article that we wrote on the back of a roundtable that we hosted back in Singapore. And that article is actually forming the base for the conversation today. So if you don't have it yet, we'll pop it into the chat and you can find it in our LinkedIn feed. Also, after this session, we will share the video and more material. So stay tuned. It is a topic that keeps on giving. So with further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kari Horenfeld, based in Singapore since the last 15 years. He's been for more than 20 years in payments, previously in Canada. He's an external advisor for Bain, and he's run his own payments consultancy when he's not helping us at the Emerging Payments Association Asia. So Kari, thank you very much for taking the time to lead this conversation today. And I'll hand it over to you and you can introduce the panelists.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Camilla. It's my pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. And a special welcome, of course, to our panelists, Stella from Standard Chartered, Greg from SWIFT, and Stephen from FIS. As Camilla mentioned, my name is Kari Horenfeld. I will be the moderator for today's event. And as you know, today's hot topic briefing will look at how various ASEAN ISO20022 implementations are and will impact corporate banking. Now, this session is actually a follow-up to the roundtable discussion we held in person on 27th September. So to set the stage, I wanted to briefly touch on what was covered at that session. Greg kicked us off with some perspectives from SWIFT regarding how they are addressing some of the friction that exists with current transaction processes and flows. While there wasn't exactly consensus on the risk numbers, there seemed to be general agreement that ISO20022's promise of richer data could address many of the current risks. We also had a healthy discussion regarding the challenges of ISO20022 implementations versus the potential upside. Greg and Stephen both suggested that banks should be considering a more holistic approach in their ISO20022 programs and projects. And this was countered by our FI guests, suggesting that the ROI is not yet clear, and that the big prize, supporting more cost-effective and efficient cross-border payments, is still a few years from being realized. It was also suggested that because there is somewhat of a lack of clarity on the upside, meeting regulatory mandates seems to be the current priority. So with that context, today we'd like to try to do a couple of things. We want to understand what corporates are looking for and getting excited about. We want to dive a bit more deeply into FIS and SWIFT's recommendations on a holistic approach to programs and projects around ISO20022. And we want to understand if there have been any, or at least short-term successes that we can use to guide some of our decisioning. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Because this is a Zoom call, we find that these work best when they're moderated. So I'll be asking questions and follow-ups of our panelists. But as Camilla mentioned, please do feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, and we will do our very best to answer all of them. Before we start the conversation, though, Camilla has a little poll for you all to have a look at. So over to you, Camilla. Oh, Camilla, are you muted?
I'm here, but the test poll came up. So yes, 1 second. Right. Maybe just introduce the panelists and then I'll find it and I'll launch it.
All right, perfect. Well, maybe, in fact, what I'll do is I'll actually handle it. Just looking at my screen. Stella, why don't you do a quick introduction?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stella from Standard Chartered Bank. I head up the cash management sales team based in Singapore. So my remit basically is, cash management service solutioning for our corporate customers as well as non-bank FI. Great to see all of you online.
Thanks, Stella. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. very keen to have it, as ISO20022 is definitely part of my scope and the kind of topics I discuss day to day in my conversations with the Swift community. On my side, I take care of all the major payment initiatives driving innovation for Swift in the cross-border payment space. So many things, but ISO is definitely one of the priorities.
Great. And Stephen, last but not least.
Yes, thanks, Kerry, and welcome everybody. My name's Stephen Peters, based in Singapore. I look after enterprise payment solutions for Asia and ASEAN and North Asia, and really helping customers to find the best solutions for wholesale payment processing, which is largely driven by the ISO20022 agenda, of course. Across all the markets in the region, we're seeing ISO20022 initiatives being launched or have been already in the market in some places for a couple of years. But the big question is, how do banks, how do corporates leverage that infrastructure to improve their businesses? So they're the kind of questions that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Looking forward to the chat.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Camilla, back to you. Are we okay with the poll? Brilliant. All right, everyone, please feel free to have a look at the poll. We'll give you a couple of minutes and then we'll take a look at the results. Looks like necessary pain for the gain is the top, and massive product and service enable. That's excellent. I mean, I think that that's a nice tone setter for the rest of the conversation. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much all for that indulgence. Why don't we get started? So I thought, Stella, I would start with you with the first question. So why are corporate customers keen to see ISO 20022 implementation proceed? And what are their priorities?
Hi, yeah. So I represent the client voice in this panel, given the nature of my work, right? So, when client approach us for implementation, once the services and solutions are concluded, typically we look at what will be the connectivity options. I mean, while we've seen a lot of client moving towards API banking, but from an MSC perspective, they're still looking very much at ISO XML formats. So typically when they come to us, okay, first question is, do you accept ISO XML format? Do you actually have experience in terms of such implementation, in terms of connectivity? So I would say that, when you look at corporates in ASEAN, whether is it a local corporates or be the MNCs, they have certain level of expertise in this particular area. And the fact that, they are well banked, they typically use one or two banks in the region. In terms of experience implementing ISO XML is already there. They even have a team specialized in that. So where possible, they want to leverage on, the investments they already have in such connectivity. That's one. And, they also want a bank agnostic connectivity. So that's two. And I think third, most importantly, is that in terms of the file formats, they are standards and they are industry standards. Where possible, they want to follow. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so you touched on a couple of really important things. There's already existing experience. They're looking for, as much as possible, agnostic connectivity. I love that terminology. And maybe most importantly, standards. We know ISO 20022. While it is a standard, there are flavors of it. So, keeping standards in mind is an absolutely important thing to do. Okay, Greg, I think because this was something that you kicked off in the roundtable, I'm going to put this question to you. Maybe just a brief recap on the recommendations that were made during the roundtable discussion regarding holistic approach as the right way for FIs to consider ISO 20022 implementations.
So, sorry, can you repeat again?
Yeah, maybe I was just hoping maybe you could recap briefly the discussion we had on why holistic approach is the right approach to ISO 20022 implementations.
Yeah, certainly. So I would say first, holistic approach. Why? Is because what we see is often banks or sees ISO and previous formats of MT and everything being just part of the channel for payments. But what we see is it's the Swift, just often the Swift channel or these kind of channels for payments is just one kind of black box in an organization. It sits there and kind of nobody touches this, and the only specific part of the organization or the architecture. But actually, all these formats, all this data flows everywhere in the organization. It's just a gateway to go everywhere into your security systems, into your corporate trade, and so on. It relates to the much broader organization. So first, we discovered that through the migration, saying that actually the impacts of the migration are much bigger than just like sort of the Swift channel or your messaging infrastructure, for example, the banks. But it goes very, very deep. But the opportunities are as such. And it's very important to think about it globally, I would say, organization-wise, because there are so many things you can leverage all together when you want to build or enjoy benefits from ISO 20022. And there are things you can leverage also from everywhere. You need to leverage from everywhere. So not to build that multiple times, but also to really multiply the benefits of it. And especially also because the benefits we see to ISO 20022 are not only related to certain aspects or certain use cases or certain departments, but they feed each other's. Taking the example of rich data and data analytics. Well, if you combine that with what you get from different streams of the business and different systems you have, the value is really multiplied. Being able to put rich data such as invoices in the payment will help the customer, the direct relationship with the customer, to make things processed more quickly within the bank. But once it gets transformed into a cross-border payment, that also brings a lot of value in that sense. So everything sort of needs to be connected, and everybody needs to come together because it touches everyone.
Great, yeah. So really important that while an implementation, quite frankly, could even be funded by only a single business unit within a financial institution, yep, the potential is much broader. Thus, the need to be more holistic. Completely agree with that. So Stephen, maybe over to you. So Greg's talked about sort of the holistic approach. And maybe, although this is an ASEAN conversation, maybe we might take it a little broader, because obviously this is a global standard that's being implemented. But how are most FIs currently approaching implementations and migrations of ISO 20022, and how are those progressing? You're muted, Stephen. Sorry.
Thanks, Kerry. Sorry. Yeah.
Continue to be the number one statement during Scoop calls.
Yeah. So look, the experience of ISO migrations around the world has been going on for 15 years, and it really started in Europe with some of the early work around SEPA, separate credit transfers, separate direct debits, and the bulk scheme initiatives, and also driven by PSD1 originally, PSD2 more recently, driving a lot of initiative and innovation around strong customer authentication and bringing pay by bank at point of sale and other innovations like that into the payments ecosphere, and that was designed to let's say make payments a little bit less card centric, and really trying to take away some of the market power of Visa and MasterCard in particular, and we're seeing real-time payments in particular be very successfully adapted, I think, in every market. So the take up of real-time payments is typically almost a hockey stick sort of curve after 2 or 3 years. It's really fast adoption, and I think that's really a good sign for. And they're all ISO 20022 schemes, and that's a good sign for the health of the industry, and it's expanding the ability of banks to serve underbanked or unbanked segments of the population, people who previously couldn't get a credit card, but can be served through wallets with real-time payment capability, for example, using QR codes, of course, for convenience at point of sale. So those are the sort of initiatives that are being rolled out globally. But everyone's having, a slightly different approach. I think Asia is still trying to assess really what it means. Europe had more time, and they've been dealing with it for 15 years, as I said. Asia is in a sense sitting back, particularly around some of the approaches to the market infrastructures. And there's some banks that have embraced it and done a full ISO implementation, and whilst others have done a conversion or a converter, which is really a temporary mechanism at best, because the ISO schemes will continue to innovate, and Swift and ISO.org have been very clear about that. The conversion is only kicking the can down the road, and banks really will find themselves in some trouble if they don't continue to investigate the solution and find out how they can migrate their infrastructures as quick as they can. Greg was saying that it's touching every part of the payments journey across the bank. That's absolutely the case, from core banking to risk to treasury to FX to reporting. Each of those areas is impacted and needs to be brought into the overall solution set.
Right, excellent. Just quick follow-up, maybe both you and Greg can respond to this. Just you mentioned, I want to dive into later what are the key benefits for FIs and for corporates, but you mentioned the uptake, and you said that I guess you were principally focused on some of the consumer side uptake when, for instance, you have QR code and payments enabled by ISO20022 notifications. Can you talk a little bit more, one or both of you, about what else drives some of that uptake? Yeah,
look, I can. I'll be a bit provocative, I guess, but I like to say that banks are technology companies now, whether or not they realize it, because they're defined by their competition largely. And the competition is not the bank next door or the bank across the street. The competition is Apple or Google or Amazon or other tech giants yet to come. And the one thing that those tech giants all do is leverage data as part of their DNA. It's the way they think, it's the way they operate. Banks have lots and lots of data, but typically it's not very well integrated. It's not very well leveraged yet. But ISO, I think, will be a catalyst for reimagining how banks can build a strategic asset out of the data that they have flowing through their systems today. And if they can do that, they will be able to, if they choose, reposition themselves in the payments marketplace. Because the other thing that we're seeing at the lower end of the scale in particular is banks being disintermediated by some of the wallet platforms. I'm talking about Grab or Alipay or whatever, and those platforms are collecting all the payments fees, and banks who aren't able to compete effectively there are just providing custodial services for the deposits. So I think if banks want to truly be successful, putting themselves into some of those commercial spaces will be an advantage.
Greg, any thoughts? So Stella, I'm just going to ask you for a second to put your banker's hat on and maybe respond to some of what Stephen was saying earlier. Do you agree with banks as technology companies? Do you agree with the statement around use and dissemination of data, that sort of thing?
I guess, depends on how you look at it, right? I think in the form of FI, in Centchart, you've seen...
Can you hear me?
Sorry, Greg,
much better now.
It's better, we'll come back to you. Thank you.
Sure.
No, Stella, you go ahead. We'll come back to Greg.
Okay, so I think you've seen in the market in terms of how banks are investing in terms of technology. I mean, from a data standpoint, yes, we do have a lot of information we collect. Question is that how we make use of the data internally and also how we make use of the data back to the customer. I guess maybe one example which I can think of just recently is that in terms of the ISO standards where we return the customer back the file in terms of CAMT, for example, for recon. While there is actually an expansion of fields where we give back more information, but we do realize that customers tend to sort of like hard code their recon file to match back to their ERP system, right? So as such, when we do such opening up more data, more fields, their recon file get impacted. So I guess it's also much about education back to the customer. I mean, there you are wanting more information while we feed more and we realize that you have code, right? So it has to be a certain way of communication, which we need to do more. But I think gradually, as we see, there are demand for data. Especially peer information, pay information, where we are able to capture, we tend to be able to return it back. But the question here is also, in terms of formats, how standard can it be, right? We all know not all clearinghouse capture certain information, right? So how do we send it back? I guess that's actually the inconsistency I'm seeing so far, across the markets.
And I think maybe just an add-on to that, how are you seeing, what are the responses from corporates in terms of some of the integrations? What are you hearing from them?
I guess in terms of integration, it is always a client-driven discussion, right? I mean, whatever way you want to connect with the bank, we have the solution, we have the expertise. Yeah, the question here is more how familiar you are. What is the urgency? Because at the end of the day, ISO to them is pretty easy to implement, pretty easy to onboard. I guess when it comes to testing, recon is always the key, especially I think for the corporate clients I'm managing. Recon is always a key because they are heavily dependent on the CAMT reports, for example, for recon purposes. Should there be any delay, any changes, it sort of impact all their downstream customers.
Excellent. I think I want to go back to one thing that Stephen said, and maybe Greg, you can respond to this one. Stephen mentioned disintermediation due to some of the fintech players. What are you seeing, in that space? I mean, I love the comment around how banks, in some instances, are relegated to custodial services, essentially in support of what they might see as their competition. So, how are you seeing that impacting, things like the urgency to implement ISO 20022, or even looking at ISO as a holistic approach within the FIs?
Okay, so on my side, I have to say, so ISO is being adopted by the banks, but for sure, but it's also indeed being adopted by the fintechs. So in terms of payment messaging, that is becoming the standard, just because it really makes common sense. I have to say that the adoption at the domestic level of ISO for multiple payment market infrastructure also does set it as a standard. So example, it's the example in Singapore, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia today in the region. And it's just driving the overall adoption and building that global standards. Also, there is, and I mean, coming back to the point of Stephen, there's from the tech companies, the fintechs, they are used to leveraging data for their own business. So just more naturally, they will adopt a data rich standards, and because they will also be able to
Oh, is that right? We just
Sorry?
Sorry, Greg, I thought we lost your audio for a minute there. Please keep going. So
indeed, in terms of adoption of ISO 20022 for fintech, that is very much the case. And I would say the mindset is slightly different from a lot of FIs as well, where they really take it as more as an enabler than as necessarily a compliance project in that sense. But I have to say also that the fact that they don't have as much legacy does help a lot.
Okay. All right. So with that in mind, then, what are you seeing? And maybe Stephen, you can feed into this too. What are you seeing as the bank's key priorities? I mean, obviously, we know there are a number of regulatory mandates in the region, but beyond the mandate, what are the bank's key priorities?
Priorities for the banks in terms of exposures. So one big aspect comes to supporting a lot of the payment schemes, the PSPs and the money remitters with more data. So being able to have something which is straight through with an ISO message, which contains the data of the ultimate beneficiary or the true sender of the message, which goes through the PSP and then through the banks. That's one key use case, which is very much being explored today by quite a few banks. So enabling that as part of their messages. Another aspect I see is really sort of what I would call purpose-built payments, where basically you set up or design the payments for specific industries or specific purposes. So a payment is not just a payment anymore, it's a payment related to trade, related to security settlement, related to remittances, where you have more and more that sort of granularity, rich data, and also link to documentation or processing, basically. And that's another service, the service the banks are trying to build more and
Right, makes sense. Any complex payment that requires, a number of add-on features like bills of lading and other documentation, really important to be able to support that in a single transaction message flow. Stephen, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key learnings that we have is that the information about a payment is more important than the payment itself. The purpose of the payment, why was it made, where was it made, who was it going to, who are the beneficiaries, and what is the associated information around that payment, are all the areas where banks can add value across the value chain. And Greg mentioned that you can facilitate that through APIs into third-party payment providers. You can also facilitate, as you were saying, Kerry, some of the more complex workflows in different vertical or purpose-built payment segments. And I like to see that banks are making investments in different verticals now. So CBA last year or the year before bought White Coat Technologies, which is a health firm, a health clinic, a chain or network. So they're clearly thinking about how to provide more services in the healthcare realm. Amazon itself is also famous for making investments in this space, and is certainly something to watch. So banks can put themselves into these complex workflow spaces. Real estate is another one. Motor vehicle purchase is another one, where there's a lot of documentary requirements, but at the core of it, there's a payment as well. So these are all spaces that banks can offer additional services and put themselves back in the center of some of those commercial transactions.
Really interesting, thinking of banks actually acquiring companies that aren't necessarily affiliated with banking, but are adjacent to for the purposes of leveraging all of that new rich data. I think that's really interesting and fascinating. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about a couple of different things around standards connectivity and priorities. Let's do a little bit of a deep dive into how FIS and SWIFT help financial institutions prioritize and help them towards the success of their projects. So, this is where I'm hoping you guys, Stephen and Greg, can we talk a little bit more about that, the sort of the granularities on the holistic approach. So how do you, when you're engaging with financial institutions, help financial institutions prioritize their projects? What are you saying to them? to help them move their initiatives along. Again, I know there are headwinds of regulatory mandates, and again, back to the point that you know, there are still some, you know, questions around ROI. But what are you guys doing in, to help the successes and prioritization? Greg, why don't we go to you first?
Okay, let me try this one. So on our side, so first, obviously, our priority remains the migration, making sure everybody is ready, I have to say. But we're already looking at the next step, the future. So on our side, what we're going to very much leverage on the SWIFT network, which will be sort of really the future of the SWIFT network and a smart way of processing transactions. But that is very much for IFIs. Beyond that, on ISO20022, what we're trying to do now is very much document the use cases we see across the globe from our conversations. We're still, I would say, at the beginning, but we want to document that as much as possible, provide testimonials, and give ideas to everyone. And that's the other thing. The other thing, how do we enable is really by managing the standard itself and making sure it's as flexible enough so that organizations can come together between FIs, between a corporate and a bank, to be able to have their own standard, have their own world where payment of everyone, the bank having their own message type for their community, basically, but still which could be passed on to the other banks without any problems. And I would say the last point is working with the corporates themselves by, again, documenting their use cases and making sure that they can work with their banks to really leverage all of that.
So FIS is helping customers reimagine or review the entire journey. And that means from the point at which the payment is initiated through to the point at which it leaves the bank. And that's kind of the solution space we operate in. And this is very important because what we see in a lot of banks today is that they might have, let's say, 10 different ways to initiate a payment across their various channels, whether that's front office or back office, etc. But they're also often doing that same thing 10 different ways. So the limits checks, the disbursement checks, the sanction checks, the way that they access core banking, the way that they do the FX is different across every channel. So one of the things that we want to try and do is bring a level of harmonization and standardization to the way that payments are initiated. And somebody mentioned in the chat through the paying 001 messages, through the way that enterprise services like limits are consistent across every channel. The way that they're doing disbursement checks is consistent across every channel. So this is where you get into the concepts of the value proposition for payment hubs, where you have a set of enterprise services, irrespective of the channel and irrespective of the payment itself. And the payment hub simplifies the integration architecture across the bank, as well as bringing harmonization and standardization to the way that payments are processed enterprise-wide. And that's really where we try to drive our customers to achieve that level of sophistication. ISO20022 at that level is really just hygiene. It's a compliance initiative. It's there, and you can use it to unlock additional payment flows through the enhanced data capabilities. But it only makes sense if you're also looking at the other parts of your payments infrastructure. ISO20022 itself is not a magic bullet.
Right. All right. I think we've got a question in the Q&A chat, so let me read that out. It's from Michael Trotter. Welcome, Michael. How much discussion are banks and corporates having on the benefits of migration channels to using the ISO20022 PAN format to ensure data is rich and consistent from end to end? Most of the current discussion seems to focus only on PAX messages with CMAT messaging to follow. I'm guessing, Stephen and Greg, that's going to be one question for you guys.
Well, it's touching on, it's kind of part of what I just answered, Kerry, in terms of trying to harmonize and remove the differentiation that banks frequently have across their channels. If you can adopt the ISO standards for payment initiation, which is the PAN 001, for credit transfers and other variants for direct debits and so forth, then you can build your channels to use those standard ISO services consistently, and all of the intelligence around how to do limits checks and other things get moved out of the channel and into a payment hub. And you can build all of that around the PAN 001 and direct debit message standards. So that's how you can achieve that level of standardization, irrespective of how you're going to clear with PAX, of course.
Greg, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, on my side, on the topic of how much conversations between corporates and banks, I have to say that the banks are still, my feeling, are very much focused again on the migration itself, still not yet exposing that too much to the corporates. However, it also depends, and I think Stella was touching a little bit on that, on the level of maturity and the pure size of the corporates as well. Some are more ready than others, and then these discussions happen more than others. Other aspect, and I think that's on the maintaining the rich data, it's a more important topic for certain corporates than others as well. So I've mentioned, so AML is obviously a big topic. So if you have certain industries where having this rich data is key to make sure that the payments actually go straight through, because of the underlying business and the underlying purpose of the payment. And so these discussions happening, I'm thinking about remittances, I'm thinking about certain regions where they have more problems with payments being blocked than others. And these conversations are happening differently, and the banks are trying to lead on that to really solve the pain points of the corporates. And I would say that these discussions are going to have to happen. They need to happen to make sure that these benefits are enabled and made available to all corporates. And I would say that the earlier banks have this conversation, understand what the needs would be from the corporates and what they can leverage on, the better. And that will be a key differentiator for the banks as well. The ones able to tackle ISO20022, expose that to their customers early, will be the main benefits. I had that example just last week. I was meeting with a bank in Vietnam who was mentioning ISO and saying, well, we've started exposing ISO messages to our customers. They don't understand. They are completely confused. It's pages and pages of documents, and yes, it's true. ISO, you don't expose ISO like you would expose an empty messages. That's why you need to build your channel. You need to find a way to expose just the right data to your customer. You need to find a way to integrate that, so that it's not a pain, additional pain you put on the customer, but actually you bring benefits to them, and you bring more data.
Brilliant. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, the benefits specifically. But I think it's probably a good time to go back to Stella, because your point on conversation with corporates, and typically when we develop products, we want our customers to be helping lead that conversation and those initiatives. We have, unfortunately, a bit of a reputation in the payment space that we kind of create our own problems and look to solve them. But I think, obviously, for ISO, we have an opportunity to create internal efficiencies within financial institutions and actual real benefits for corporates. So Stella, just your mind, you've talked a little bit about some of the sort of near-term stuff that corporates are hoping to benefit from ISO integrations, but what do you think the medium to long-term potential opportunities are in terms of efficiency, in terms of products and services? What are corporates looking to happen further down the line?
I mean, there's actually a wide spectrum, but I think let me try to generalize as much as possible. I think, when we talk to maybe just one example I can use is that one of the multi-corporates where, we have a number of their so-called business across the region. During implementation, I think the challenge you're seeing here is not so much about, FI and corporates trying to go on ISO. I guess it's also the domestic infrastructure on the clearing side, which I'm seeing is very lagging. So simple things like tax payments, they have to use through various routes, may not be able to buy at ISO standards, for example. They may have to use a combination of a host-to-host, a combination of check payments, and a combination of web payments. So I think this is actually quite inefficient. So that's one. And the other spectrum is that when I look at, my fintech PSP providers, right, the requirements from them is demanding, I would say. But AML is actually important. When we look at ISO, we look at both collections flow and also we look at payment flows. Information subject to banks' interpretation of information being passed through is also not consistent. So when we look at, say, for example, payment transparency in terms of what we demand, we realize that some of the formats are not acceptable in certain markets. And we have to get the customer to change. So, the poor customer has to think, for, say, for example, if I have a on-behalf payments, because which is typically the case for, this kind of players, I have to remember I have to use one format for payments into some countries and a certain format for payment into another country. So this itself is also not consistent, right? So I mean, in the mid to long term, while we look to serve service